Thank you. You know, last night I was wondering what kind of Kerouac fan, after a Friday night together in Lowell, would be able to get up at 9 a.m. to be here. So I'm really impressed. You're really the Kerouac hardcore fan club, if ever there was one. Anyway, my background, I come at all of this from a different perspective. I'm a public administrator. I ran the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission, which was a federal commission that existed from 1978 to 1995. It was meant to be temporary. It was meant to do things, make physical improvements in Lowell to augment the national park. So we were working with owners of historic buildings to get the buildings renovated to a higher standard, to set the standard for how historic preservation should be done. We created, you hear the trolley go by, we actually had the trolleys built and the track, acquired the track and upgraded the track so the trolleys could operate in Lowell. We envisioned a series of canal walkways. Like you see here, the canalway system here is something that we put together. So there were a lot, and there was a public art element and a lot of cultural programming. So the commission had a number of well-known local Franco-Americans involved. Armin Mercier, who later became a city councilor, Armin LeMay, who had been a city councilor and was for a while chairman of the commission, the federal commission. They were, and of course Paul Marion, who was a staff person. He was the director of cultural affairs. I was the executive director, and we worked together very closely. So what Paul reminded me is that the original idea for honoring Kerouac was going to be a plaque over on Central Street, the walkway by, for those of you who know it, the Trio condos. So if you're at the Central Street Bridge and you look down at the hotel the other way, up the canal, and there was just going to be some sort of plaque or something like that. And in the course of things, it became apparent that this area was going to become a park. And that opportunity opened up the potential, and various people had brought forward the idea that this should be where the Kerouac Commemorative should be. So what was here at the time was a 9-story concrete warehouse. And as someone involved with the demolition of that warehouse, I can tell you it was built to last. That steel reinforced concrete does not come down easy. It was a tough demolition project. So basically what happened was there was a hope to develop the Massachusetts mills. There was a hope to renovate what was called the Cirque building over here. Locally it was called the Surf Hotel. And then the Bridge Street boarding house was decrepit, and there was a desire to see that renovated. So, and there was really a feeling that the warehouse had low floor-to-ceiling heights, maybe 6-7 feet, because the things that would be put in the warehouse, like if cotton went into that warehouse, you'd push it forward. So you didn't need height. Nobody was lifting up the cotton to put it up high. So it had become a storage, container storage place. So you could go in and rent a cubicle and have your storage there. So over at City Hall, the staff in the planning department designed a landscape here, an idea for a landscape, and so we did a little pilgrimage into Boston. So as the city manager and the planning and development director and myself from the Preservation Commission, there were a number of folks, and I think Paul Songus might have been there. I can't remember, to tell you the truth. And we met with a guy named Frank Keefe. Now, those of you who have been around Lowell a real long time, back to the Pat Mogan days, might remember that Frank Keefe was the city planner for Lowell. So he was somebody who picked up this idea of creating a national park and a lot of the ideas that Pat Morgan was espousing. But he had moved on, and in the Dukakis administration had held several high-level positions. So he was Secretary of Administration and Finance in the Dukakis administration at the time this idea for the park came up. And I don't know if you can comprehend that the guy who controls the purse string at the state level is a big deal. So even though the money was Heritage State Park money that was being proposed for this, Frank Keefe had no hesitation at all to commit this money without talking to DEM, Department of Environmental Management, right in the program, which I always thought was a little unusual. So we all went in with a plan. It was literally one piece of paper and a few numbers, and the numbers added up to $3 million. And Frank Keefe said, I know that building. When I was planner in Lowell, I went in that building. That's terrible. Nothing's ever you can't redevelop that. Nothing's ever going to be done there. So he said, absolutely, consider this approved, and I'll get it down, let the agency know, etc. And we're going, this is nice. So many of you know of the name Joe Tully. Joe Tully was the city manager, and Joe was a little rough around the edges. Let's just keep it general. The people who know are laughing hardest. So Joe literally leaned over the table with a pen and crossed out the 3 million and wrote in 3.5. He says, if you're going to be that agreeable, let's do it right. So we picked up another $500,000. And believe it or not, back in those days, they would never do this today. Within a month or two, they had sent us a check for $3.5 million. Sent the city a check for Now you don't, you have to wait for reimbursement and all that kind of stuff. So the city acquired the warehouse by eminent domain. 200 warehouse tenants had to be relocated, no small feat. The thing had to be demolished. Well, let me tell you, out of $3.5 million, that was a big chunk of it. There really wasn't that much more money for a park. So the park was very much grass, a walkway or two, some small trees, and again putting in the railing along the edge there. So that was pretty much it. So that's when we got into the discussion that, hey, you get this great location, and couldn't something more be done to make it enticing and attractive? And the whole thinking about the Kerouac, and the suggestions came from various sources, moving the Kerouac Commemorative over here. And then we turned to another committee chaired by Paul Songus, which was the Lowell Public Art Committee. And the Lowell Public Art Committee was bringing in national artists to Lowell and having them spend a week here to get immersed in the town and to have the planners show them various locations around town where art might be appropriate, with the idea that the artist would choose the location. Not they were against the idea of plop art, where you just say, this is the spot, you can put something there. They said, no, the artists need to gravitate. So Ben Montana from San Antonio, Texas, was one of the artists invited up here. There were a number of artists, and they were looking at a number of locations, and Ben gravitated to the Jack Kerouac topic, and also to this site. And of course, the city had already had Brown and Rowe landscape architects involved. As I'm standing here, I'm looking out behind you. Look at this tree right behind you. There was no tree. There were no trees. This was a warehouse. Okay. So the fact that these trees in 30 years are here is just amazing. Well, we had another problem, which was that we wanted to give the money for the public art related to Kerouac to the city because it's the city's park. So the city had to enter the deal and get it done. Well, that meant that the city council needed a vote to accept the funds from the federal government. It was $100,000, to fund the sculpture. And it also meant, because it was a grant to the city, that it needed to be signed off on by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, who at the time was Donald Hodel, this is 1987-88, in the Reagan administration. So the issue comes before the city council, and sure enough, one councilor, and some of you remember Brendan Fleming, and Brendan was indignant that the drunk was going to get a statue. Okay, because that's what everybody envisioned, was a statue of Jack Kerouac. I don't know what the pose would be, but anyway. So this set off quite the debate. The council vote was favorable. They accepted the money, and we sent the message up to the Secretary of the Interior, and he signed off on the grant. So Jack got, official endorsement from the City Council and the Secretary of the Interior in the Reagan administration. So that's quite a thing. I recall the San Francisco Times running a story about Brendan Fleming and his opposition to Jack Kerouac being honored in Lowell. So that's how far it went. But that leads us to the words on the sculpture. Just because the sculptor and others came up with the idea of representing Jack in writing. It's not him, it's not his face, it's not a bust, it's not a statue, it's his words that were being memorialized here. It became apparent that they needed to get literary rights to use the words. And I seem to remember it was Houghton Mifflin who had had published. So Paul Marion of our staff communicated with Houghton Mifflin, and they said, "Oh, you need to talk to Stella Kerouac. She's down in St. Petersburg, Florida." So Paul started sending letters to St. Petersburg, Florida, and we were getting no response. So one day, when Paul wasn't in the office, I was, and my secretary came in and said, "Stella Kerouac is here to see you." Well, this is going to be interesting, and it was. So John Sampas brought in Stella Kerouac, and they came and sat in my office, and I described what was going on with the park, and I described the public art process, and I described what we'd like to do for Jack, and they took it all in, and I said, "By the way, we have a model of this park." I said, "Let me go get it." So I go out to our outer office, no model. I said, where the hell is the model? I want to show it to them right now and hopefully we can get this approval. And they said, "Oh, the model is over in the city manager's office." I said, "Okay." So I call over the city manager's office. "Can we come over? I got Stella Kerouac here. Can we come over and see the model because we need her sign off on the words?" And so we walked over to City Hall. We went up into the city manager's office, and there was the model. And later on, when we got the approval, and it was probably John Sampas who told us later on that what impressed her was that the model was in the city manager's office. That it was like it wasn't just some crazy artsy Kerouac aficionados who wanted to do this commemorative, but that the city had appreciated it enough and was behind it enough that the model was over there and being shown in a favorable way. So Stella did sign off on the words, so it's all legit, folks. And then off we went to the races. The construction was tough because when the building was demolished, there was a lot of debris left under the ground. So now, as you tried to do a paved surface, a lot of stuff had to be excavated. So there's like a second phase of excavation. There's a lot of nasty stuff that goes on in the demolition construction into things. But we got the mandala design to represent the Buddhism related to, it looks like a cross, so it relates to Catholicism. it was a chance to really augment what this park would be about, so that this commemorative is a plus for the community, I think. This park would have been very bland without it, but also it's so great to have you all here, and I think we're all so proud to have this commemorative and to have the recognition of this native son here in Lowell. And I'm glad from the Preservation Commission and that I could be a part of it. It wasn't a pretty process to get it here, but here it is. And thank you all for coming out this early morning to hear about this. So thank you.